John Locke on Freedom, by Samuel Rickless. First published on Stanford Encyclopedia Philosophy. Part 3. Voluntary versus involuntary action/forbearance. Within the category of actions/forbearances, Locke distinguishes between those that are voluntary and those that are involuntary. Locke does not define voluntariness and involuntariness in the first edition of an essay concerning human understanding, but he does in from the second to the fifth editions. The forbearance or performance of an action, consequent to such order or command of the mind, is called voluntary. And whatsoever action is performed without such a thought of the mind is called involuntary. Locke is telling us that what makes an action/forbearance voluntary is that it is consequent to a volition, and that what makes an action/forbearance involuntary is that it is performed without a volition. The operative words here are consequent to and without. What do they mean? Henceforth, following Locke's lead, I will not distinguish between actions and forbearances unless the context calls for it. We can begin with something Locke says only in the first edition. Volition, or the act of willing, signifies nothing properly, but the actual producing of something that is voluntary. On reflection, this is mistaken, but it does provide a clue to Locke's conception of voluntariness. The mistake is that not every instance of willing an action is followed by the action itself, mistake of which Locke likely became aware, given that the statement clashes with the rest of his views and was removed from the second to the fifth editions. To use one of Locke's own examples, if I am locked in a room and will to leave, my volition will not result in my leaving. So willing cannot signify the actual producing of a voluntary action. However, it is reasonable to assume that, for Locke, willing will produce a voluntary action if nothing hinders the willed episode of motion or thought. And this makes it likely that Locke takes a voluntary action to be not merely temporally consequent to, but actually caused by, the right kind of volition. Understandably, some commentators have worried about the problem of deviant causation, and whether Locke has an answer to it. The problem is that if I let go of a climbing rope, not as a direct result of willing to let it go, but as a result of being discomforted/paralyzed/shaken by the volition itself, then my letting go of the rope would not count as voluntary even though it was caused by a volition to let go of the rope. The solution to this problem, if there is one, is to claim that, in order for an action to count as voluntary, it is not sufficient for it to be caused by the right kind of volition. In addition, it is necessary that the action be caused in the right way or non-deviantly by the right kind of volition. Spelling out the necessary and sufficient conditions for non-deviant causation is a steep climb. Chances are that Locke was no more aware of this problem, and was in no better position to answer it, than anyone else was before Chisholm in 1966, Taylor in 1966, and Davidson in 1980 brought it to the attention of the philosophical community. Locke's view, then, is that an action is voluntary inasmuch as its performance is caused by a volition. The volition, as we have so far presumed, must be of the right kind. For example, Locke would not count the motion of my left arm as voluntary if it were caused by a volition that my right arm move, or a volition that my left arm remain at rest. Locke assumes that in order for an action A to be voluntary, it must be caused by a volition that A occur, or, as Locke sometimes puts it, by a volition to do A. What, then, on Locke's view, is it for an action to be involuntary? Locke says that an involuntary action is performed without a volition. This might suggest that an action of mine is involuntary only when I have no volition that the action occur. Perhaps this is what Locke believes. But it is more reasonable to suppose that Locke would also count as involuntary an action that, though preceded by the right kind of volition, is either not caused by the volition or caused by the volition but not in the right way. Some commentators have worried that Locke's locked room example is a problematic illustration of his theory of voluntariness, at least as applied to forbearances. Locke imagines a man who is carried, while fast asleep, into a room, where is a person he longs to see and speak with, but who is there locked fast in, beyond his power to get out. He awakes, and is glad to find himself in so desirable company and stays willingly in the room. Locke makes clear that, on his view, the man's remaining in the room is a voluntary forbearance to leave. But one might worry that if the man is unable to leave the room, then it is false to say that his volition not to leave causes his not leaving. At best, it might be argued, the man's not leaving is overdetermined. But, as some authors have recently argued, cases of overdetermination are rightly described as involving two or more causes, not a single joint cause or no cause at all. On such a view of overdetermination, it is unproblematic for Locke to describe the man in the locked room as caused to remain both by his volition to remain and by the doors being locked. Another problem that has been raised for Locke stems from his example of a man who falls into a river when a bridge breaks under him. Locke describes the man as willing not to fall, even as he is falling. The worry here is that Locke holds that the objects of volition are actions or forbearances, so the man would need to be described as willing to forbear from falling. But, it might be argued, falling is not an action, for it is something that merely happens to the man, and not an exercise of his agency, so his willingly forbearing from falling would be willingly forbearing from something that is not an action, and this is impossible. The answer to this worry is that falling is an action, according to Locke's deflationary conception of action, which counts the motion of one's body in any direction as a bona fide action. The end.